Hello, and welcome, and thank you for coming to the fourth in the series of Newtown Talks. We really appreciate everybody coming out, especially for this discussion, which is tough but very important.
According to Zero Abuse Project, there are 39 million child sexual abuse survivors in the U.S. today. 39 million. And 1 in 6 men have had an abusive sexual experience before they turn 18. Sadly, though not rare, this kind of abuse is rarely reported, which is why it's so important to have discussions like we're having here tonight.
Before we introduce our guests, I just want to take a moment to thank the folks who make this series possible: our technical director, Grant Ossendriver, our photographer, Phil Keane of Blue Sky Farm Productions, Bethel's Birds Books, and I want to give a special shout out tonight to Miranda Pacquiana, a tireless advocate for victims of child sexual abuse, who was also instrumental in bringing our guests here tonight.
And now for our guests. Anthony Edwards is well known for his many acting roles, including Dr. Mark Green on the TV series ER, as well as Goose in the blockbuster Top Gun. In addition to being a Golden Globe winning actor, Anthony is a survivor who served as chairman of the board of 1 in 6, an advocacy organization dedicated to male survivors of sexual abuse, and travels to universities, military bases, and beyond to raise awareness about the impact of sexual abuse on male survivors. He currently serves on the board of the Zero Abuse Project, which is a nonprofit committed to transforming institutions in order to effectively prevent, recognize, and respond to child sexual abuse.
Stephen Mills is the author of Chosen, a memoir of stolen boyhood, which won a 2022 National Jewish Book Award. He's also the co-author of Next of Kin, My Conversations with Chimpanzees, a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year. Since 1983, Stephen has advised and written for an array of public interest organizations in the fields of human rights and environmental protection. He also serves as an ambassador for Child USA, the leading nonprofit think tank fighting for the civil rights of children. With a few notable exceptions, writes Stephen, the lack of memoirs by men survivors of child sexual abuse stands in stark contrast to the many moving and transformative accounts by women. I think it's incredibly important to pierce the silence and tell these painful stories. And here to tell their stories, please welcome to the stage Anthony Edwards and Stephen Mills.
So we're going to talk about childhood sexual abuse. That'll be fun. That sounds like a great evening. Whose idea was that? Don't worry, we all feel that way when it first comes up. But one thing, little housekeeping we'd like to take care of is that sometimes we've experienced that when people are speaking openly about their experiences, for people it can be triggering. It can bring up personal memories of maybe the first time that they do that. If that does happen, don't be afraid of it. You're not alone, and if you need to, you're more than welcome to get up and go to the lobby and take a break if you need to for a second. There's no one's holding you in here. And we hope to be honest, but we also don't want to feel like you have to stay or anything, and otherwise we will keep the conversation open and transparent.
Thank you. So I think it's good to start with each of you sharing your stories. So I'm sure there are many people here who don't know your stories. So I'd like to kick it off like that.
Okay. All right. Well, sit on the leg. Gotta go first. My name is Anthony Edwards. I am a proud member of your community. Been here in Sandy Hook more as a weekender, but since basically 1980. So I've been coming here for a long time and have had a home here, some of you know, since 2000. My experience started in the town that I grew up in, Santa Barbara, California. It was a beautiful town. It was a town that on the ocean. I had a very happy young childhood. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. My father was a non-treated post-traumatic stress survivor. He was a World War II veteran who suffered and witnessed some really horrific things in Italy when he was 19 years old, and he never, ever talked about it and kept that trauma buried his whole life. And we know it now because in the later part of his years of his life, like with a lot of trauma survivors, you can't keep it from coming out. And in the last years of his life, he would be racked with pain and sobs of guilt and feeling shame for what he experienced. That given, for me, I guess when I was a young kid, my dad wasn't that he wasn't loving, he just wasn't present. He wasn't able to communicate probably the way we all as fathers hope we could. Leaves a little bit of a hole, a bit of a gap. But one of the fortunate things was that I found, because in Santa Barbara at that time, they had a tremendous amount of theater in the schools. And when I was a 12-year-old going to junior high, I found the theater, and I found acting, and I had an incredibly wonderful teacher who showed me the world of it. And that became my church, my religion at 12, the way kids grab onto something. So I look at that in hindsight as something that helped save me, helped me in my life, because later, in a summer theater program, an older man, 24-year-old man, came in there who was an incredibly charming, charismatic leader, had been in the theater in Santa Barbara, and he, unbeknownst to us or to anyone, was a young pedophile who was starting to work on his grooming skills, and he created a group of 5 of us that circled around him. We worshiped him. He very intentionally picked kids that were looking for, maybe in my case, like I know my friends were missing a kind of a father figure, and he filled that beautifully. As a result, by the time I guess I met him when I was 13, by the time I was 14, and these friendships and this group had become very powerful. It's when he started kind of separating and manipulating and grooming in a physical way. He started testing it. And my specific biggest traumatic event happened because of us being on a sleepover staying at his house. We were going to Disneyland. This was all done with the okay of parents and everybody, because everybody loved Gary and trusted him. And so didn't seem weird that I was going to stay in his sleep. I'd be the one who got to sleep in his bed with him while everybody was in couches in different places in the apartment. But that event of having a physical sexual assault when you're that age, when I was that age, it doesn't compute in a child brain, because everything was about love and about fitting in, and I was there for that reason. So the trauma that happens that I experienced, something that Stephen writes so beautifully in his book, is the simple fact is a betrayal. It's a betrayal that happens. Someone you trust, you love, is doing something that it doesn't compute. And as a result, you get silent and your survival skills kicked in. And that was the event that kept me even tighter in with that group of kids and kept me silent. So I don't know that I need to go into much further than that, but that's kind of the beginning. That's what it was. In what happened, though, I guess is how I ended up here, is that, like so many, the average age for a man to disclose is 30 to 40 years. So the fact that I didn't actually start talking about it until I was 52 years old is pretty average. And the reason why I did is because 20 years earlier, when I was 30, I had my first child. And there's incredible strength that happens when a man becomes a father. And I had by chance run into Gary on an airplane. And I saw him and I said, what you did to us when we were kids was wrong. And I don't know if you know the airport at Burbank, but It's a long walk from the plane to the baggage claim, and he walked with me that whole time, the whole way, telling me how what he'd done was wrong, that he'd gotten help. He stays away. He's not abusing anybody. He's very remorseful. He's gotten help. He now has a child. He's married, and I bought it, I guess, which is what you do. And so what happened is, 20 years later, he ended up in the news because he was on a lawsuit along with Brian Singer and other men who'd been accused of child rape. And it hit me like a bullet because the betrayal and the lie and everything came back in such a big way, and I really wanted to kill him. And the rage was huge, and I wanted to take out an ad in the Hollywood Reporter and say, Goose and Dr. Green was molested by this man. It was a total revenge fantasy. But I didn't. I was lucky because I had another dear friend who said, let's get the stick out of your eye or put your oxygen mask on first, and then you'll deal with him. And got me into recovery and got me with a therapist and groups that could really help. So that's why I'm here today, and there's all kinds of other small circles that make us connected.
Yeah, so my story unfolded very close to here, about 12 miles away in New Milford. Beautiful little town, I'm sure you're familiar with. And up from Route 202 outside New Milford, there's a camp called Camp LFOs, right up on Little Bear Road. It was founded by United Jewish Appeal Federation as a place for working class Jewish kids to get away from the sweltering heat from New York in the summer. And I started going there when I was 10 years old. I thought it was paradise. That was where I learned to fish, to hike, go camping, made tons of friends there. My third summer there, when I turned 13, there was a new director by the name of Dan Farinella. Now, Dan Farinella was a big, tough guy with a heart of gold, right off the street of the Bronx. He was beloved by the kids who came from the Bronx, and most of the kids came from the Bronx and Brooklyn. Loved by the parents, by the administrators, by the counselors, and just a big, outsized personality. And right at the beginning of that summer, he suddenly started showing interest in me. And this is a little bit like God reaching down and showing interest in me. I was just, I'd never spoken to my school principal in my life. The director of camp was on high, and he'd pull me out of lunch and take me for walks in the woods, and he'd talk to me about my family problems. I was in a step family. My father had died when I was 4. And he acted as if he were my best friend. We were becoming good friends, best friends. It was a really, really deep bond. And it wasn't until that fall when he called my mother and asked her for permission to bring me up to camp to help him out get some work. That weekend was the first time he assaulted me. And that was really just utterly changed me, changed my life. It was an out-of-body experience. It was a break in reality. That's the only way that I can describe it. Everything I thought I knew about the world, about myself, about this person who was suddenly not who I thought he was. He was this total stranger and had no idea what he was doing and why he was doing it. Terrible anxiety, depression, gastrointestinal issues. I was very suicidal. Didn't attempt suicide in those years, but it was constantly there in my mind. In my early 20s, I learned that Farinella was molesting boys in a different Jewish summer camp in Illinois. And when I learned that, it was like a light bulb went off in my head, like, oh my God, that's what happened to me. And he's doing it to these other kids. And it's almost like the magnitude of it hit me like a thunderbolt. And I spoke to senior staff in that camp who knew what was going on and did absolutely nothing to try to stop him or report him or even confront him. And this was my first inkling of the kind of collective silence that shields perpetrators and lets them go on abusing kids. And I hope we talk more about that. But that was my first encounter with that, and it kind of blew my mind. I confronted him myself that summer. This is 1978, I was 23. He told me verbatim what Tony just shared about what Gary said. I've never made that connection before. Oh yeah, it was horrible. It was horrible what I did to you. I'm going to stop. I'm getting out of camping. I'm getting help. He's married, he has a kid. His kid was in camp. And I heard what I desperately wanted to hear, that was it, and I didn't have to go any further. I was too deeply ashamed to even think about trying to report him. It was about 8 years after that where I found out that he had moved on to yet another Jewish summer camp, this one outside Pittsburgh. Now, at that point, after really trying to erase myself in every way possible, I had stumbled into therapy and had figured out enough that I knew I had to try to stop it. And what I did was to start calling up old friends from camp here in New Milford. And on the first call, found 5 other victims, 5 names from that one person. So clearly there was a large web of victims and people who knew, and nothing had ever been said publicly. And I got statements from them, which was no easy thing to do, from 3 victims, 3 witnesses. This was 1986. I took them to the FBI and the Pittsburgh DA. Those law enforcement agencies sat down with the Jewish Community Center of Pittsburgh, confronted them with the evidence, and instead of investigating, prosecuting, as far as I'm concerned, handcuffing him on the spot, he was let go quietly. No one in that community was ever informed of what had happened. He was never prosecuted, and he was free to go on abusing children elsewhere. He died 6 years after that. You know, at that point was when it became clear to me that it wasn't enough for me to overcome my own shame. There was this collective shame that I was up against. And it's taken me a long, long time to really reckon with that and really come to this realization that there is no taboo on child sex abuse in our culture. It happens way too frequently to call it taboo. You know, if a kid was beaten up by an adult, or 1 of 5 kids was beaten up by an adult, you wouldn't say that was taboo behavior. What is taboo is talking about child sexual abuse. That's completely taboo. Becoming a little less so, but still very much the case. And I mean, just to kind of wrap it up, because I think that's why we're here tonight, this collective code of silence, in my mind, has to do with a fear of a collective break in reality. And what do I mean by that? I mean that when you raise the possibility with a school or a community or in a family that
a person who is beloved, who is esteemed, who is revered, actually turns out to be a con artist and a child rapist, well, that is going to make people's heads explode. Most people have a really hard time holding in their head these two things, that someone can both be a supreme professional and so esteemed, and have a private compulsion, sexual compulsion that is so destructive. And to really let that in means having to take a hard look at, well, what did we believe, and who are we, and how are we complicit with this? And that is terrifying for a community. It is much easier to say to the victim, couldn't you just get some help and get on with this? Can't we all just move on? Maybe you can forgive, and we can all keep living this fairy tale. And over and over and over again, that's what we see. And if, just to underscore that, and if you think that what I'm talking about, oh, well, that's 40 years old, when my book came out 2 years ago, all of Farinello's employers, not a single one of them showed any interest in getting to the truth of what had happened to the thousands of children that had been entrusted to him, that they had entrusted to him. On the contrary, what they did was to silence me. So just for example, the JCC, who the FBI and the DA confronted in Pittsburgh, banned me from their social media. Because I was trying to reach out to victims to let them know they're not alone. They didn't want that to happen. God forbid anyone in the community should find out what happened in their community. So this is why talking about this is so important, because it's the beginning of confronting the truth.
I think I've heard you say, I wrote it down, predators are protected by human nature.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you're saying. Your book blew me away. I've read things on sexual abuse before, but nothing that ever I felt that I was reading from the perspective of a 13-year-old. So I often thought, wow, if I had this when my kids were little, I would have spoken to them differently about this issue, because it's not just, oh, watch out for strangers. In fact, it's nothing to do with stranger danger.
Yeah.
Just a thought there.
Well, the stranger danger thing is super important, and it's the flip side of what I was just talking about. It's so easy for any of us to say, oh yeah, there's an instantly recognizable, creepy-looking guy who's potentially a criminal and has nothing to do with us or our community and is preying on children.
Exactly.
That's probably 3 or 4% of, that's real, but it's a very small fraction.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who are, as you both mentioned, charismatic figures.
Yeah.
There's parallels between camp and an acting coach to the abuses we see in the church, and the cover-up, and the moving on of priests and clergy people into other areas to make it not our church's problem. So there's something about that, right? Also with the parents, that they're kind of flying under the radar, right? There's something else. It's like a Jekyll and Hyde type of a situation.
And I think there's a couple of really big stigmas that need to be shattered and because that's another way in which they hide. There's a huge one, which is that if someone is abused, they will go on to abuse. And that's a huge silencer for men, because the fear is, oh, there must be, I will hurt children. And that's just not the case. Yes, there are people, pedophiles who were abused, but when the numbers are that an average pedophile in a lifetime of work will harm 200 to 300 victims, which is why when we hear about a priest in a church or whatever, that they saw when someone comes out, all of these come out. So, the numbers don't back up that if you are abused, you will abuse, is a really big stigma. And the other thing is that, we're living also, we just hit the nail on the head right now. We live in such a homophobic time. And the way certain people in this country have associated any kind of child abuse with homosexuality is horrific, when the fact is, the vast majority of male abuse on young boys is by heterosexual men. That's how they identify. This is not a gay fantasy to abuse a child. And that mythology keeps people silent. And you have to dispel those myths by saying it out loud.
Just a quick thing for both of you. When you spoke, when you confronted your abusers, I heard them say, I stopped, moving on, so on and so forth. I didn't hear an apology. Did either of them apologize that you can recall?
Yeah, he apologized, but the sickness that you witness up close is, and I think to this day, he really thought he was being loving. It's their version of love. I mean, a real abuser is doing it for all the right reasons. You know, they're not doing it because they're sick. They're doing it because that's the love that you need. I know you need it. This is how we express love. And that's where they talk about, I just read a study today that between 1960 and 1990, in the Boy Scouts of America, which we all know is in the news recently, that it's probably 3.4% of Scoutmasters were abusive. 3.4%, you know, out of thousands and thousands. So the numbers are huge. In that, the old joke of like, if you were to bank, you know, where do bank robbers go? You know, I mean, if you want to, you rob a bank, right? Like this institution of the Boy Scouts of America was the perfect foundation for pedophiles to become scoutmasters in and work. In the same way, protected through the church, or in Stephen's case, through, you know, these youth-serving organizations that don't have infrastructure. And if you're a pedophile, you're like, I want to go there.
Yeah, and that's super important to realize that that's just the basic math of this is there's always going to be a certain percent of the population that are pedophiles. Mm-hmm. It's going to be with us forever. There's something deep in the human genome and whatever it is that, you know, brings that out. The variable is how we respond to that.
Yeah.
And we can respond and we have to respond. But, you know, sticking our heads in the sand and pretending that, you know, pedophiles are not attracted to, as our friend Jim Clemente, a surviving a former FBI agent, says, target-rich environments, is really keeping our head in the sand. So the more we can educate ourselves, be aware, you know, not to live in fear. It's really not about that at all for us or our children. I mean, study after study shows that parents who talk to their kids about these things from a young age actually create more resilient children. The parents are more resilient. Their bonds are deeper, and they're better prepared to face the possibility.
A good thing your book does is help a parent understand exactly what grooming is, and that it's not the big bad, you know, guy who's mean or whatever. But one point, because you write about how the term sexual abuse is meaningless to a child. Adults, that's what we see, that's what we call it.
Right.
But there's reasons that neither of you were able to share what was happening to you, and I think it's important to talk about that. Like you said, your mom outrightly asked you, right? Was he abusive, and you said no.
Right, and that's where because that's what kids do. When your world is that, you're not going to rat on it. You're not going to, because that world and surviving with that friend group was the most important thing. I mean, that's where, you know, a lot of people now working with Zero Abuse Project, and Steve does wonderful work with Darkness to Light and other organizations, that the concern comes from young parents too. Like, how do we keep our kids safe? What do we do? And I would like to argue to step back a bit and talk about that stigma, is that the way we keep it safe is we also allow the victims, because right now, if it's 1 in 6 men in this country, as you said in the beginning, that's 30 million American men are walking around right now not talking. That's also 30 million advocates that are not speaking. That's 30 million that are not going, you know what, this thing happened to me, wasn't my fault, I don't want it to happen to you, and are having the conversation. So to Steve's point, I mean, we're not getting rid of, perpetrators are going to be around, but our reaction time is what we can change. And by taking stigma away, we can lower the age. So it's not 52 years is the average. Because the sooner we act, it's the sooner we can separate these pedophiles from children. Because that's there's no cure, there's no treatment. Someone doesn't go like, yeah, I used to be a pedophile, and I'm all better now. It's a compulsion that's out of their control. It doesn't rationalize or justify it, but it's our reaction to it as a society is really.
Yeah, Stephen, you had mentioned in the book that, when you realized what happened to you, when you could process that you had anger towards your mother and Ken.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything looking back, that you wish they would have done differently, would have asked, would have recognized some signs? And maybe it's the child protective factor that doesn't show any signs because they don't want to, they know what they're experiencing isn't great, but is there any way that we could to break through to a child?
I think my mother was pretty much a classic case, which is that she almost immediately told me that she had suspected something, which my stepfather waved off. She obviously had talked to him about her fears. And he said, no. But of course, look, she grew up in the 1920s and 30s. She was carrying her own baggage, had her own blinders on. She herself revered social workers, right? So huge blind spot for her.
You have a line in the book when they allow you to go to the Bahamas with what were they thinking?
Yeah. And so just to finish up on that, and I think that's a really important thing to be aware of, is that, and it's one of the things that lies behind this syndrome you see over and over and over again, how it's always the most revered social worker, the greatest coach, the greatest sports doctor, Larry Nassau, Robert Anderson, all these people, right? And people again can't reconcile this with who they turn out to be, not realizing that the so-called good that these people do in their careers is all engineered to get access to children. It's no accident that they're at the pinnacle of their professions. They design it that way, so that, and in other words, so they come into a community with that kind of status. They've essentially pre-groomed every adult and every parent in that community. Dan Farinella came in bulletproof because everyone knew he was the best social worker in the Bronx. Who was my mother to think, maybe he's molested? What? Well, how could that even, how can you hold that thought in your head?
I'm good friends with James Safechuck and Wade Robson, and they're the two gentlemen who were the victims of Michael Jackson. And they came out in that, if you've not seen it, you should see it, called Leaving Neverland, this documentary that is spectacularly honest and brutal. And the world knew, the world saw the truth, and they looked the other way.
Yeah.
They go, oh, no, and the world that I live in, which is theater in New York, I mean, the producers of the MJ musical stopped doing their musical in Chicago when they were testing it out, their Michael Jackson jukebox musical, because at the time it was called Can't Stop Till You Get Enough. That was the name of the musical. The documentary came out, told the truth. They all were stunned, and the press releases were, well, I guess we have to rethink. And all they did is just stop, pause, call it MJ, came back in, and went under the cover of, we're just looking at his artistry. So here we are, a community that prides itself in about equal rights for women, LGBTQ rights, all this thing. But make a movie make a musical about a child rapist, that's okay. That's the kind of built-in stigma that we're dealing with. Because it's uncomfortable, like I said at the beginning, no one wants to hear about kids getting hurt and raped. Oh, I don't want to.
Yeah. I also, the charismatic figures, right, and the way they are groomed here. I'm wondering, it makes it harder for the victims to speak out too. my own situation is a little bit different. I was a sophomore in college. I was physically and then sexually assaulted by a fraternity brother within hours. And he was kind of a celebrity on campus. Part of my not saying anything was, who's gonna believe me, right? I'm kind of this, nobody, everybody knows this guy. He's like the, big man on campus type of thing, life of the party. That's part of what I think maybe keeps people quiet too, because I'm gonna take this Dan Farinella down, I'm gonna take some revered figure, some popular person.
Also, what you write is kids believe they're the only one.
Yeah.
And if it's happening, you bury it.
Yeah, a big part of, and I really want to honor what you just shared, Lee. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And that power imbalance, that power imbalance is a big part of the problem, and how perpetrators use that power. And also, when it comes to children, isolate them. So that strategy of gradually breaking down boundaries with a child, emotional boundaries, verbal boundaries, physical boundaries, and eventually sexual boundaries, is very methodical and carefully carried out. And isolating the child. I was so isolated, I barely was aware. As it turned out, I personally know 12 other victims from camp. When I talked to the FBI, she guessed there were hundreds. We're talking campers, kitchen boys, townies from New Milford who worked at camp, boys. And I was oblivious. How's that possible? Because I was so, I spent my entire existence like this, just trying to hide myself.
And they're the masters of making you feel special, that you are special. You are the chosen one. We have a very special bond, and secrecy is hugely powerful. This is our secret. We keep secrets. We know what happens. And so I think an image you can have for what happens to a young person, it's like a switch goes off, and the world goes from unconditional love. Our friend Marty Moran is a wonderful writer and survivor. He says, a child's job is to fall in love. That's what children are meant to do. They're supposed to fall in love. And our job as adults is to keep them safe. When that doesn't happen, the switch goes off and the world goes from a loving, safe place to a completely conditional place. Everything's different now. Everything has a rule to it and a conditionality. If you do this and this and this, you can stay in. If you can't, you can't. And that applies to then becoming, in my case, ragingly codependent. And it helped me as an actor, because I could really assess a room and know what was safe and what wasn't, because you're constantly seeing how you can survive. And Stephen's book so describes this beautifully, his lifetime's journey of that in different situations. And when that switch goes, everything becomes conditional. And as a result, I ended up, why is it that I married an ex-heroin addict who still had problems? Like, I knew that if I did all the right things, I could fix it, And that power dynamic, which Patrick Carnes calls the betrayal bond, the triangle, in which the abuser's on top and underneath is the enabler and the victim, which is what we do. We bounce back and forth between enabling and victim. And as long as that structure's in place, your self-worth is so small that you never would think of empowering to take someone down or to confront, to be honest.
I have a question about something that you said, Anthony. I heard you say pedophiles have sexual compulsion and later say they are expressing love. Which is it, or is it both?
Well, we're a society that uses sex and love interchangeably in relation to power. That's another thing that kids are hearing, which is in our world, whoever gets gets laid wins, or whoever has the most sex wins. And so that socially gets interchanged in the wrong way, of course, and love becomes a power, and whoever, that's, it's really, we really need to step back a bit.
This is an important question. I was abused from age, where did it go? It just disappeared. Oh, there it is. I was abused from age 5 to 13. I struggle with sexual relations because I feel like sex is dirty, shameful, and disgusting. Can you relate? How do you get past these feelings? I know, Stephen, you write a lot about this in the book.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really common shared experience, and everyone's journey out of that is different. I mean, I had kind of a very serial monogamous life until I met the woman who would become my wife when I was 30. So there were like 12, 13 years there where I went through God knows how many girlfriends and never disclosed to any of them, and I was pretty much out of my body whenever I had sex. I wasn't there. And some of them they knew, that there was something wrong there. But I didn't trust enough. And it's getting in touch with the shame, the fact that you recognize that shame, you know that shame. That's fantastic. That's the place to start.
Yeah.
Because unless you can name it, and you know that it's present, you know what it feels like in the body, you can't let go of it. Knowing it is the beginning of letting go of it. And, I just want to, I don't know how many of you have been tracking the case in France right now, Dominique Pellico, but her whole mantra of transferring this shame off of the victim and onto the perpetrators where it belongs. That's the journey. And it took me 50 years. I mean, what can I say? That moment when I realized that law enforcement wasn't going to do anything and was essentially saying, you're the crazy one. We're letting this guy go free, right? That was 1986, right? I didn't publish my book until 35 years later. That's how long it took me to let go of the shame.
You also make a point that's not often made, because it's a difficult point, but I think it's very important, that a young person's body will respond and sometimes feel what is pleasure. And
almost always. And that's also part of the difference between
a cat can walk past a 12-year-old boy and get an erection. It's like...
I was going to choose a different animal.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so many, and that's part of probably the discussion in relation to how do we keep kids safe. And we talk about that. We can talk about erections. We can talk about the fact that, there's no matter what that is, no one is ever allowed to touch you in any way. I mean, those things can happen, and people are afraid to talk about it, I think. I know, with having raised 4 kids, because you're like, oh no, I'm going to make them scared of the world, or that will, in a sense, bring it on in some way if we talk about it. And that's exactly what the perpetrators want, is just stay quiet and don't talk.
And I think part of the shame, or maybe the guilt in it too, is that if it is physically pleasurable to you, then how can it be wrong? Or does that mean I'm going to question my sexuality now because I was excited?
It's super confusing, and it's also important just to note that it's one of the differences with boys and girls. I mean, and those in between who suffer a lot of similar emotion and fallout here. And with boys, it's really, like Tony was saying, in terms of boys having like instant erections. Perpetrators know that. They're counting on that, and they know how to turn it against you, right? And it's that visible evidence, right? Like in my case, Faramilla's thing was, oh look, you want this.
Hey, He gave you magazines.
Yeah, here's a magazine, here's porn. 13 seconds later, Stephen has an erection. Oh, you know, I can help you with that.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember being scared Dan would tell my parents what I did.
Right.
Which was a line I heard from literally every victim I spoke to
Really?
from Camp Foes. I was terrified he was going to tell my mother. So there you go.
So,
I mean, he would talk about that, yeah, this is how I make sure that you're growing up properly. I love you so much. I'm
Looking
gonna
out
make
for
sure
you.
that I'm just checking to make sure that you're functioning,
Yeah.
growing as you should.
Yeah.
That was the,
So for anybody that's here, I mean, I didn't, my situation was definitely different than yours. I was older, so I could kind of defend myself, but I didn't tell, I could count on one hand, and I only told my mother on Sunday because it might come up tonight and she's in the audience, right? So I never, I didn't tell my now wife until we were in a relationship for a while. So for people that are struggling with this, that have had this happen to them, people that might be in the audience, it has to have a profound effect on their lives and relationships. How do we make it safe? How do we provide the spaces? Is it places like 1 and 6? How do we make it safer for people to come out and
we talk about it as normalizing the conversation, and part of the thing, which is why I talk about my dad a lot too, is that there is something that we can all relate to, whether we've been abused as children or not, is what happens when you have feelings that are buried and they don't get out. You know, how detrimental, because the physical abuse has a time period in which it happened. It's the emotional abuse of having to sit on trauma and not let it process out. And that's where I think we can communicate about it, where you can listen to someone and relate to what has happened in a general way in relation to what it would be like, as we all know in life, of what it is to carry that first heartbreak, or those things that hurt us, or the loss of someone. What is the trauma of going through loss? And that the important thing is to talk and not necessarily solve or fix, which is, I think, a big problem for men, because we're like, well, if we can't fix it, then why do we want it? Yeah.
I think also a lot of people feel it comes through emotionally or psychologically, and you write a lot about, Stephen, the damage to our nervous systems.
Yeah.
That trauma is not necessarily going to come out, in a talking relationship. Can you talk more about that, like what trauma can look like, what it did for you guys physically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm convinced it rewired my nervous system, and which is kind of astounding. But, and actually when I went to therapy, it was after a year and a half of having really a physical breakdown, all sorts of problems with my body, and going from doctor to doctor, as I described in the book, and ultimately winding up at a psychiatrist who did biofeedback. But he asked me to tell him what was going on with me, and after 15 minutes, he said, "You've got shell shock." This is before PTSD. This is 1982, which is actually the year PTSD started entering the medical lexicon. But I said, well, like, how can I have shell shock? It wasn't in combat, it wasn't in the Army. He said, well, you're sleeping in a war zone, and that's when your defenses are down, and when your nervous system is triggering and blowing up. And it is, I know guys who were sexually molested once for 10 minutes when they were 12 years old, and 40 years later sleep with a gun under their pillow. Most people really don't comprehend just how intense the experience it is, and how it radiates through the body, and every body is different. We all manifest in different ways. And it can be through the more common ones of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation. men who were abused as boys kill themselves at a rate 10 times the general population. This is a huge, just devastating toll. Every time I hear about a man taking his own life, I wonder if he was sexually abused, because so many were, when you start looking into the stories. And so it takes so long because that experience, as Tony described and I tried to describe, it's almost the conscious mind can't take in what happened. And that is a good thing when you're a kid, because it lets you go on functioning, it lets you survive. I had to get up Monday morning after I was sexually assaulted and go to school. And my body kept what happened from my conscious mind. But it starts taking a toll on the body, but you're not aware of it until you're aware of it.
Did acting do that for you at all?
Well, it's funny because acting became my safe place, because when I could be in a situation like being on ER, 8 years, be able to go to work, the trust that's required to make scenes believable is like heaven for me, because there is no fear there. It's a loving, trusting thing when people are actually, when it's good. So that's why I was saying that became like I'm good because I was so scared of the other stuff that I really wanted to make this work. And
I'm so lucky to have that.
yeah, and that's where you'll see that, where people will overachieve in a way. Like, I don't think I would have necessarily, but that's part of our survival tools. What do we use that, I was lucky that trick worked well for me. But the problem is you can't sustain it. And it's unsustainable when that grief, that trauma is there. And men will often talk, that's why we always talk about triggers and things, and not just gratuitously, but because certain things will make things move. And I had the experience of just 4 or 5 years ago, hearing a podcast of a woman who was a rape victim, who she got to a point, and it wasn't what she was saying, it was the honesty in which she was expressing herself about the fact that she felt like she brought it on, that it was her fault. And it hit me in a way, and I was like walking through the West Village with headphones on, and I had to stop, and I started to throw up in the street, and these sobs and rags came out, not unlike my father at 92. And because I realized, and I made a phone call, but I was going, oh my God, in my deepest part of me, believed that this is my fault. I brought this on. I needed Carrie to love me. So that's why he had, I needed that. This is all my fault. And to carry that is, and that's where we can look for signs, I think, in friends and relatives and everything, because the symptoms are obvious. I mean, excessive drinking, self-abuse, and also failed relationships is a really, a flag that I see with people, where they keep trying the same thing over again, and expecting different results, and not able to connect with others, because isolation is the ultimate place where people end up hurting themselves in frighteningly permanent ways and at very high percentage.
For you to be able to connect that episode on the street, though, with what you needed as a kid, that's pretty pivotal.
It's not a choice. It's there. It doesn't, there was no, God was very clear at that moment as to what was happening.
I heard you say on an interview.
It was a little different for Stephen, right? It was a little different for you, where you were kind of being chased by these demons and you weren't connecting the childhood experience in the way it came
but
so
this
clearly
is well
to you.
into recovery. I mean, I'm saying this is, I've been working on
So
looking
you had
at
no,
this stuff.
okay, all
This
right.
was not I was only to say that that's how powerful our bodies and spirits are in how they can survive. And it was able to stay there as long as it could, and then it has to move.
But I've heard you say on an interview that women got angry with a lot of what Me Too was, women getting angry, which they should and they did, but that men are already angry.
Yeah.
And what they more need is to go in.
Yeah, well, I had that experience because when I did write my piece, I literally was about to publish it, and that's when the Harvey Weinstein thing blew up. So I stopped for 6 months and watched and witnessed, and then also learned a lot that my experience is that women really did need to and have gotten together and gotten angry. Men, a lot of us, and men that we meet, and as we do in our lives, have been angry for so long. There's so much hidden rage and anger. I remember my ex-wife saying to me, "Why are you so angry? What's so angry?" I'm like, "I'm not angry." I mean, but you're carrying this rage. And so the fact is, because my initial impulse, like I said, was to get violent, to kill him. What's really needed is to get soft and do the opposite. And that's where Stephen and I are really fortunate. We meet with a group. And men need to get soft and get quiet. And that's where, when you know someone who says, "Hey, this thing happened to me," just let them speak and don't fix and don't worry about having to think about therapies or anything else, because the simple act of words or writing down can be transformative to someone actually turning that corner towards healing.
And getting soft kind of goes against our social construct, right? Individual rugged, we don't ask for help. Men don't ask for help. That's a sign of weakness.
Well, we're soft to begin with, right? That's where this all goes back to, is defenselessness, powerlessness,
Yeah.
helplessness. Those are tough places to
That's
go
not
back
very
to.
manly.
Admit to,
to
right?
do that. Yeah.
Right. So how have you, now you realize this, how have you processed through it? I mean, not that you ever get to the end of it, but therapy, I guess group sessions and listening to each other with shared experiences, for those that just might not have be even aware right now that they've suffered, or, what could be ahead of them, what has helped you?
It's like I said before, it's different for everyone, but, for me, a lot of the journey was finding my way back into my body, because I really had been disassociated for so long. And that can still happen, it's just way less frequently. And so, for me, it's all about anything that helps get me closer to the truth of what actually happened is a tremendously healing thing. And that could be anything from doing yoga or dance or anything that makes me feel embodied, talking therapy. In my 30s, I did a lot of psychedelic drugs because which had recently been outlawed, MDMA especially, and of course is now back being clinically studied to help those who have been traumatized, and open windows to me into essentially let me short circuit the fear, because this is all about reliving fear and being in a constant state of five-alarm fire, fear, 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 circumventing that and being with what actually happened and being able to say, yes, this happened to me. And the next step from that, though, collectively, is for the community to say, yes, we acknowledge this happened to you. Here I am 55 years later, I am still trying to get that acknowledgement from my community, and I have to go to court to do it. So that tells you, again, something about, the collective code of silence in this culture.
Right. For those, it's very hard, I think, also for men to seek help, to seek therapy, because of the stigma, right, of brain health, or as our friend Jeremy and Jennifer, working to change that lexicon. I would just encourage people that if one therapist doesn't work for you, it doesn't mean it's not all going to work, right? You need to find somebody. I went through a number of them, and again, it must be something with the 50s, the age of 50, and I had gone through some stuff with work, but this one therapist was able to get to, maybe it was just the perfect storm of where I was, that I didn't realize that I had been emotionally abused as a child by my father. I had no idea. And she told me that, yes, you were, and you sold suffered low-level depression and anxiety your whole life. I probably had half a dozen therapists before that never got to that point. And that was kind of shocking to hear, because in my mind, my childhood was normal. Now it's different than this, because it wasn't, to me, it wasn't obvious. But I would just encourage people that when you're talking with people and sharing things, you're not always going to jive, and maybe it's just not the right timing. Maybe they don't ask the right questions to get at something if you feel that there's something wrong. Just keep trying.
And know that, I hear a lot of stories from men who were abused at a very young age that had no recollection at all until in their 20s or 30s when stuff started to come up. But no, like, oh, this is something I'm bearing or ashamed, because in the same way we shut down socially, or even when we know, physically in our survival technique, we will shut down too. That being will do it. And I will say just one thing too, that if there is, we have an organization called 1in6.org, and on that website, it's really specifically for men, and there's some really good tools there for people who are first starting out, and one of them is an online support group that's completely anonymous, and it's moderated by professionals, but you can go on, anybody can go on, and talk. And it's very private and that for people, especially for men or people or men that you know who are afraid to even go to a therapist or say anything, it can be a nice way in. And in there's also hearing stories, reading Stephen's book. But for me, I did so much reading, and that really helped. It really helped reading other people's stories and learning about other techniques and ways of doing it, because like we said, as Stephen just said, everybody's going to recover differently and require different. So you can't there's no one thing that fits all.
In public, both of you, what's been the most surprising thing that has happened, things, either positive or negative?
I'll just jump in because it's about time, is that, and I was sharing with another new brother I met tonight, that when it comes to men, if a man does disclose, comes up to me after, or sometimes something, 100% of the time after they say, this happened to me, they will immediately minimize. You go, no, it was no big deal. I mean, it's no, I'm fine, and blah, 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 I got through this. And it is such it's just ingrained in the male psyche to do, and maybe women do it as well, but men are 100% or deny it, because they just don't have those we don't have those basic first tools to admit weakness. I don't know if it's genetic or not, I don't know.
Sometimes there's a comparison that goes on too, right? I didn't experience what you did. Like, my experience was not as bad as what you experienced.
Yeah, and I did it in mine because I was like, oh, well, I was nowhere near abused as much as Scott, my buddy, who was consistently raped through his whole.
Right, so I don't have a right to.
Yeah, he had it so much worse than me, and so I can't.
Yeah, men sucking it up. Yeah. And for me, I guess on the positive surprise was, in the lead up to publishing my book, I would wake up in the middle of the night and think, like, what are you fucking thinking, publishing this book? You insane? Now everybody's gonna know. And it was just the terror of a 13-year-old.
Mm.
And then the day it was out, it just felt like total liberation. Because there was
take
no
it back.
room. Yeah, there's no room to hide anymore. It's just, hey, here it is what it is. And, on the negative side, I would say biggest surprise is the absolute refusal of these communities that I was part of to acknowledge what happened. Because it just shows how far we have to go. And I'm a big believer that organizations can, and there's many of them, who have the most up-to-date, best-in-class child protection policies, and then when a victim from the past comes forward, they shut them down instantly. Okay, so if you don't have the courage to deal with what happened 50 years ago, who's going to have the courage this summer when a kid is abused in camp, right? These are the same people.
There's a question here, I think that somewhat relates to that, is our kids are taught to trust adults, yet when a child is touched inappropriately and they tell another adult, they aren't believed. And are even shamed, prosecutors are hesitant to prosecute. How do we create those safe spaces for kids and adult victims to come forward?
Yeah.
It's a challenge, because I don't want my kids to not trust people. I want them to be able to ask for help,
Yeah.
you know,
You were, I'm sorry, fellow campers, we were writing a book, and there were a couple that either said they didn't want to talk or refused to even pick up the phone at all. Did that change at all after the publication?
It went both ways. Everyone who was really reluctant to talk or didn't want to explore it further, they pretty much stayed that way. And the book triggered a lot of fear in other victims, and I get it. I totally get it. It's just, I'm me and I've got no choice. This is who I happen to be, and I write, and I needed to write about this. But I respect their fear and their finding a way to live with it. I wish it were different. I wish I had some company, like in this court case, right? On the other hand, other victims contacted me who I didn't know about after they read the book. So, that was really beautiful and I think profoundly helpful on both sides.
Question here, what have you discovered about the shame of abuse? What is the heart of shame for both of you? And to Stephen, thank you for writing a beautiful book.
You're welcome. You want to field that one?
well, I mean, I had this amazing weekend of recovery with 40 male survivors coming together in a very safe space to workshop and do that. And we did this simple little thing, but by the end of it, we were all dancing around screaming, "Shame is lame." And so whenever I hear the word shame, it immediately combines with lame, because it is really, it is truly the weight that keeps everyone silent, is a feeling of being responsible, that this is somehow my fault. And that relieving of that shame is that's the foundation of recovery.
And it's mirrored back by those around us, unless they know enough to believe a victim, to support a victim, whether this happens inside a family or in community or camp or whatever it is. When those around us go to that response of blame the victim or disbelieve the victim and erect this shield, impregnable shield of, oh no, we're not changing the mythology of this
Right.
family,
I mean,
or
imagine,
this camp, or this community. That's why most victims say harder than the sexual assault itself was the response of the family or the community to not honor what happened.
I mean, here we are in the United States. Imagine if we had a president who'd been convicted of sexual assault, and it was proven in a court of law.
He went there.
And it didn't matter. It didn't matter. That's why I don't shop for clothes in New York City. Everybody gets raped there. I mean, it's really, it's powerful minimizing of this. It's powerful to not take victims seriously.
I read something you wrote that really struck me. You said, the culture has to change. If I see something suspicious, not only am I going to report it, but I know that I'm going to be thanked and rewarded for blowing the whistle. I'm not going to be punished. I'm not going to be ostracized. I'm not going to lose my job. A fear of all these things is very real, and it turns out that it's much harder to make these cultural changes than it is to actually just print a list of policies in black and white and put it up on the bulletin board. It says a lot. And that's
Yeah, the good news is, most of this is easily preventable. That's the crazy thing. It's the taboo that is the Rubicon. Once you get past the taboo and you start talking about it, what it takes, when I told you my story and what Dan Farinella was doing, that is a checklist of red flag behaviors, right?
Yes,
In a
it's-
child-serving
Like
organization.
to take a child to the Bahamas now, I think more parents, hopefully.
We hope. However, it's not enough to have the policy on the wall. Change happens from the top down, and everyone inside an organization has to know what the rules are, and they're inviolable, and no one gets away with breaking them.
There has to be accountability.
Accountability, everyone
Otherwise-
has to be well-trained, and we see time and time again where organizations can actually have a policy in place and employees are trained, and boom, a case gets reported, and the first thing they do is call in the lawyers, and guess what? The protocols aren't followed, and the case doesn't go to, isn't reported to law enforcement. We see this over and over. Why is this? It's because it's hard to change the culture. But the cultures that are committed to it, the organizations that are committed to it, are proving that it can be done. And I would encourage people to go to Darkness to Light. I'm on the board. They just have amazing resources. I mean, you can do an online training, Stewards of Children. In 2 hours, you will be a junior expert in child sexual abuse, how to recognize red flag behaviors, what proper reporting is, what the protocols are to follow. It's really a numbers game. The more people become aware and become comfortable with talking about these issues with their kids, in the workplace, in organizations, the harder and harder it becomes for perpetrators to get away with what they get away with.
Exactly.
I've got a couple questions I can combine there.
Okay.
The first is, do you think some people don't speak about being sexually abused out of fear of only ever being seen as a victim? How can they overcome those feelings? And I'm going to pair this with it's more of a comment from somebody. Please let the audience know that evidence-based treatments for trauma are highly effective in helping individuals heal past wounds, reduce distress, and move forward from their difficult experiences. Trauma is something that happens to you. It doesn't have to define who you are.
That last one is huge.
Right.
It's
So that the
huge.
question about feeling only the victim, not letting it define who you are. It's something you experienced, but it's not who you are.
It was one of the last paragraphs in the book. I talk about, not wanting to, look, did I want to have to go to court against UJA? Of course not. Here we are 55 years later. I don't want to be defined by these awful things that happened to me when I was 13 years old, But I'm also not willing to let it go, right? And so I have the right to justice. I'm promised justice. I don't consider, yes, that happened. Am I a victim? Absolutely not. I'm not.
And thank you for doing that, because the courage it takes and the energy it takes to go up against that, to keep, in a way, reliving that to a certain extent, to try to hold people accountable. It may be for you, for personal reasons, but it's for everybody. So thank you for taking up that fight.
Yeah, it's important for all of us. And
It is.
above all, it's important for kids today.
Yes.
That's why I'm doing this.
Yeah.
Because if I can't get justice, it ain't happening for kids today.
Yeah.
It's super important.
And it can't be easy, so thank you.
Any more
I think
questions?
so.
All right. Anything else you guys want to?
I had a thought there at the end. Think about what I was gonna.
This is just a random thought, but I want to say it's so great hanging out with Tony and talking about this, but we're actually missing our weekly group, which meets on Thursday night, which,
Wait till we tell them about what happened.
This is the first time you've done this publicly, right?
we've appeared together like at this Hopkins thing,
Yeah.
different format. But what I was going to say is that apart from all the vulnerability and emoting of that group, it is the funniest 90 minutes I spend every week, right? Which is just amazing because there's just this tremendous mutual recognition and shared, just vitality and love of life. It's just underneath all of that stuff.
Yeah, no, and also to know that, it gets easier. It gets easier for, once you start to speak, and once if someone you love is speaking for the first time, whatever, and how hard it is for them, that trust that it does get easier, because it is just a part of who you are. It isn't who you are, but it's not, it's okay for it to be there. It just can't control. It can't take over the way it has, and that's the good thing. And that's we do joke about this because, we always start every meeting going like, I don't have anything to say. I don't have anything to say. And 90 minutes later, it's like, what the hell? We just went through everything because I used to think that, women are chatty, but if you get a bunch of male survivors together, it's like, it does not stop talking because there's so much. It's such a relief for anybody who's carrying any kind of trauma that once it does start moving, life changes in a big way. And we were talking about that tonight about, like, wow, just imagine not having had this opportunity to look at this stuff that's not so fun to look at, because life is so much better with it in a different perspective.
Yep, and connections deeper, I would think, between people, and
Yep.
that's a big plus.
Yeah.
You go through pain, but you also get the
Yeah.
deeper connection.
Yeah, real connection.
And it breaks your heart when full circle of it is I just think of God, I wish my dad had more opportunity to have not had so much fear in his life, even though his exterior was charming and funny, and we knew.
Yeah.
Taking baby steps. There's a time we couldn't talk about breast cancer.
I was going to say that. That's such a great example of success. You think of the taboo around breast cancer and the amount of women that carried the shame and everything. And knock wood, but I have a sister who's a 20-year survivor now, and it's purely around stigma. I worked when I was on ER, did a lot of work with autism research because my kids were healthy. Anyway, and just talking about autism, what that did. In the early 90s and the 80s, it was still considered, refrigerator parenting is what caused autism. And there was so much ignorance around it and talking. And I just see all of the different things that are available now for kids who are dealing with it.
And
So.
with breast cancer, it was stigma. With this, it's stigma plus shame, which is 10 times more.
But it's doable. It's very doable. Even if we have to put up with the next 4 years. Okay, I said it.
Yeah, thank you, Tony and Stephen. We'll be out signing books in a few minutes. I know Gary wanted the director at Newtown Hall.
The executive director, who's just, if you could stay seated for a couple minutes, he's going to come out and say hello. It's a great new thing we've got here. And resources, you mentioned Darkness to Light, and Zero Abuse Project is also a fantastic resource.
Yeah, and 1-6.org is still all very active.
And I want to thank you for having us. This is a really, really special community to host something like this.
Gary Lindeman, the new executive director of Newtown Hall.
And if we didn't get to your questions, apologies if we didn't get to any questions, but we wanted to leave time for the book signing. Thank you.
Thank you so much for Stephen and Susie and Tony and Lee for that very heartfelt and honest discussion. My name is Gary Lindeman. I am the new executive director here. I'm here about 2 weeks, and we're just going to try to keep everyone here just for a couple seconds until those guys get settled back there for the book signing. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we've got planned for the upcoming year. again, I started this job on January 2nd, and we are going to start some new exciting things at the Edmond Town Hall. First, one of the first things I did was, or we did together, was hire Martin Barr, who is the legendary guitarist from Jethro Tull. He's going to be here on April 13th, and I'm happy to say that in the first 24 hours that we put the show on sale, it sold 125 tickets. So we're happy about that. We're going to change the ticketing system so that when you actually go to pick your seats on your mobile phone, you'll be able to do it. You can actually pick your seats. And with that, it's going to be easier to have donations. We're going to set up memberships. Don't know what that membership is going to entail quite yet, but I think it's going to involve good parking out here as well. That's one of the things we're going to be doing. And of course, we're going to have gear and more programming in general, but I'm going to have lots of programming to bring in children and the younger audience. So I think we're pretty much ready for you guys to go out there. Just take your time getting up and form a line outside, and please buy their book. Thank you so very much, and thank you.
Oh, really? Yeah, I know, but it's really, like, I was like, I kept scooching down so I could put my neck, like, stretch my